Evelyn stood in the soft morning light of her modest kitchen, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of chamomile tea as she stared out at the garden her late husband once nurtured. Now in her early 60s, the once tireless teacher had finally embraced retirement after nearly 4 decades in the classroom. Her days now moved slowly and peacefully, morning walks, tending to her flowers, a good book in the afternoon, and the occasional knitting project she rarely finished. All her life she had been cautious with money. Every coupon clipped, every bill accounted for, every dollar saved with care. She had never been wealthy, but she had been wise. After her husband Roger passed away unexpectedly in his early 40s. From a heart attack, Evelyn became both mother and father to their only son, Tyler. She worked 2 jobs for a time, tutoring on weekends, just to ensure he would never feel the weight of their loss in practical terms. She paid for his piano lessons, school trips, college tuition, and even a new car when he graduated, though she took the bus to work herself. And when Tyler struggled to find his footing after college, hopping between half-hearted jobs and vague business ideas, Evelyn had always been there. Rent money, course, a cosign on a short-term loan for an e-commerce side hustle. She signed without hesitation. Temporary withdrawal from her savings to help him and his friend Leo with an unmissable investment opportunity. She gave without a second thought, trusting her son, her only family, her life's pride and joy. That Tuesday morning, however, would become the moment her world turned upside down. She had been planning her first ever overseas trip, a tour of Italy she had dreamed about for years. She'd found a lovely guided itinerary through Tuscany and had even purchased a new travel bag in anticipation. All that was left was to transfer a portion of her savings to finalize the booking. She placed her teacup down gently on the counter and opened her laptop, humming a soft tune as she clicked through the bank's login page. But as soon as the numbers loaded on the screen, her breath caught. She blinked once, then twice, thinking perhaps she had mistyped something or the website was having a glitch. Her account balance, which had proudly sat at just over $280,000 a month ago, was now showing a pitiful $176. For a moment, she felt frozen, her mind blank, eyes glued to the screen. She refreshed the page. Same result. She checked her other linked accounts. One had been closed, the others drained. Panic slowly crept into her chest. With trembling fingers, she clicked through the account history. The screen filled with transactions she didn't recognize. Transfers to unknown names, purchases from crypto exchanges, wire transfers to a company she'd never heard of, repeated withdrawals, maxing out daily limits. It was all gone. Every dollar she had earned, saved, and tucked away for decades, erased in a dizzying series of movements she hadn't authorized. Staggering back from her kitchen table, Evelyn nearly knocked over her chair as she reached for her phone. First instinct was to call Tyler, not the bank, not the authorities, but her son. She dialed his number with trembling hands and waited, pacing in tight circles across the linoleum. It went straight to voicemail. She tried again and again. Nothing. With a pit forming in her stomach, she called the bank's fraud department instead, her voice cracking as she struggled to explain the situation to a calm representative on the other end. The next 2 hours passed in a haze of questions, transfers, and music. Slowly, like puzzle pieces forming a nightmarish picture, the truth began to emerge. The representative noted that the logins to her account had come from a device associated with her household specifically, a device used regularly in her home Wi-Fi history. Someone had also used her personal details to authorize several loans. In her name, loans she never applied for. When Evelyn pressed for more clarity, the agent gently informed her that all the activity pointed to someone with intimate access to her personal life. Someone like a family member. Her ears rang. Her head felt light. She barely registered the kind words of sympathy offered by the representative as she hung up the phone. She sat there in silence, her tea now cold and untouched, the air thick with a sense of betrayal that hadn't yet fully settled in. For hours, Evelyn couldn't move. She kept replaying moments in her head, Tyler asking casually for her laptop password to check a bank statement once. Him borrowing her tablet during a visit, his insistence on helping her go paperless last year by scanning all her old financial documents. It had all seemed so innocent, even helpful. She had felt proud of his initiative. But now it all felt sinister in retrospect. Her hands moved mechanically as she retrieved a folder from the cabinet-tan old manila envelope stuffed with copies of financial documents and printed emails. She had kept them out of habit, a trait from decades of dealing with school bureaucracy. Her instincts kicked in. She began cross-referencing transactions, looking for dates that aligned with Tyler's visits, scanning for names that might tie back to Leo, who had always given her a strange feeling, too slick, too vague, rehearsed whenever he spoke about building an empire. When she finally found the name Altway Ventures LLC repeated across multiple wire transfers, she knew she had never dealt with any company by that name. A quick online search led her to a bare-bones website promising disruptive blockchain, integrations with flashy buzzwords, and a team page filled with stock images. Tyler and Leo were listed as co-founders. Her heart cracked open right there in that moment. Not just because of the money, though that was devastating, but because of the deceit. The planning, the cold deliberateness with which her only child had siphoned away everything she had built. She printed out every bank statement, every digital trail, every receipt she could find. Her movements were stiff, robotic, like her brain was working independently from her body. She barely noticed the daylight fading outside, her cup of tea still untouched, her back aching from hours hunched over papers and screens. By the time she heard a key in the front door, her whole world had twisted into something unrecognizable. Tyler walked in, his usual confidence on full display, his phone pressed to his ear as he nodded to someone on the other end. He didn't notice the papers spread across the table at first. When he finally did, his posture shifted, slightly guarded, slightly annoyed. Evelyn, still seated, simply looked up at him, eyes heavy, voice soft. "Tyler," she said, her tone far more tired than angry. "We need to talk." He hung up the phone, setting it on the counter. "What's all this?" he asked, gesturing casually to the papers, though the flicker of tension in his eyes didn't go unnoticed. "You tell me," Evelyn replied, sliding one of the bank statements across the table. "Where did all my money go?" Tyler's jaw tightened. For a long second, he said nothing. Then, with a dismissive wave, he shrugged. "Oh, that. I was going to talk to you about it. It's not a big deal, Mom. It's all going to be worth it soon. You'll see." Evelyn's eyes widened in disbelief. "Not a big deal. You emptied my accounts, Tyler. You forged my name on loans. You took every cent I have." Her voice cracked, but she kept it steady. "How could you do this to me?" Tyler scoffed, folding his arms. "I didn't do anything to you. I did it for us. This investment, it's huge. You wouldn't understand, but Leo and I are on the brink of something massive. You always talk about building a legacy. Well, this is it." Evelyn shook her head, her heart thudding so loud she could barely hear him. "A legacy. You stole from me. You lied. You betrayed me. That's not building a legacy. That's destroying one." The room fell into a dense, suffocating silence. Tyler's expression twisted from frustration to anger. "You've always been so controlling, Mom. Always hovering, always judging. You'd rather sit on your precious money than help me build a future." Evelyn rose slowly from her chair, bracing herself against the edge of the table. "I have helped you over and over again. I sacrificed everything so you could have every opportunity. And this is how you repay me." Her voice trembled. "I never expected you to be perfect. I never even expected you to pay me back. But I did expect honesty. I did expect you to care." Tyler's eyes flared, and something dark flashed across his face. You think this is about you? He snapped. You wouldn't even have that money if it weren't for Dad's life insurance. I deserved part of it too. I just took what should have been mine. Evelyn recoiled, as if physically. Struck by his words, your father died so young, and I did everything I could to give you a good life after. That money was never meant to be stolen. Tyler's fists clenched at his sides. I'm done being treated like a failure, he growled. You want to paint me as the villain? Fine, but I'm not giving anything back. Evelyn stared at her son as if seeing him for the first time, truly seeing him. Without the haze of motherly hope or past memories softening the edges, the boy she raised with lullabies and scraped knees was gone, replaced by someone hardened, entitled, and cruel. She felt her knees begin to weaken and grip the table for support. You need to leave, she whispered. Now Tyler stepped. Closer or what? He challenged, eyes narrowing. You'll call the cops on your own son. Evelyn didn't answer. Her silence was louder than anything she could have said. And in that moment, Tyler's face twisted into something almost unrecognizable: rage, betrayal, fear, maybe even guilt. But it lasted only a second. Then he turned on his heel, stormed out, and slammed the door behind him so hard it rattled the windows. Evelyn collapsed into the chair, every fiber of her body aching, not from age but from heartbreak. The papers fluttered around her like the scattered remains of a life she no longer recognized. The house, once filled with laughter, memories, and the echoes of her husband's piano playing, now felt cold and foreign. She had lost her savings, yes, but worse, she had lost her son. Not to death, but to greed. And though she didn't know what would come next, one thing was certain: she would never be the same again. Evelyn never thought her own home, though, space where she had once cradled Tyler as an infant, decorated Christmas trees together, taught him how to make pancakes on Sunday mornings, would become the setting for the most violent betrayal of her life. But as the echo of the slammed door faded into the suffocating silence, she sat alone at her kitchen table, the torn remains of her trust scattered across the wooden surface in the form of printouts, bank statements, and scribbled notes. Her hands shook, not just from shock, but from a profound emotional rupture. The kind that leaves you feeling like the floor has collapsed beneath your feet. She didn't cry, not yet. The tears were trapped behind a dam of disbelief, stunned by the realization that the boy she had loved more fiercely than anything in this world had not only stolen her life savings, but had looked her in the eye and justified it as his right. For hours, she didn't move, didn't eat, didn't answer the phone. And when night finally draped itself over the neighborhood like a heavy curtain, she left the lights off and just sat there in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old house settling, as if it too were uneasy about what had happened. By the time the morning light poured in through the front windows, golden and indifferent to her devastation, Evelyn was still in her chair, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her body aching from stiffness and age, but her mind strangely alert, like something had snapped into place during the endless night. She wasn't sure what she was going to do yet, but she knew one thing: she couldn't pretend everything was okay. So when Tyler returned 2 days later, striding into the house like nothing had happened, his tone annoyingly casual as he said, "Hey, Mom, we need to talk," Evelyn didn't jump to her feet or rush to meet him. She remained seated, her eyes steady on his face, and said softly, "You shouldn't be here." That took him aback. His cocky confidence faltered slightly as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, scanning the kitchen like he expected an ambush. "I figured you'd cool off," he said, dropping his backpack by the door. "Look, I've been thinking, and I want to explain," but Evelyn raised her hand, interrupting him, her voice still quiet but unwavering. "I've had plenty of time to think, too. I looked through everything, every loan, every forged document. I know what you did, Tyler, and I know it wasn't a mistake. You planned this." his jaw tensed, eyes narrowing. So what? Do you want me to grovel? Beg for forgiveness? He snapped, stepping closer. You always act like your money is sacred, like you earned every cent with your bare hands. But let's be real, Mom, most of it came from Dad's life insurance. If he hadn't dropped dead, you wouldn't have had half of it. Evelyn inhaled sharply, wounded not by the accusation, but by the sheer cruelty in his tone. Your father died working overtime so we could afford your school supplies. Don't you dare minimize what we both lost, she said, standing slowly, her knees cracking beneath her. And yes, I earned what I saved. Every hour spent teaching, every tutoring session, every sacrifice I made was for you, not for me. Never traveled, never remarried, never even bought a new car. I built a future thinking you'd grow into someone who'd value it. Instead, you took it from me without a second thought. That's when Tyler exploded. His voice rose, arms flailing as he paced the kitchen. Do you think you're some kind of martyr? Do you think you're better than me because you suffered in silence? Newsflash, Mom, I didn't ask for that. I didn't ask to be the center of your little charity project. You controlled everything, always made me feel like I owed you. So yeah, maybe I took the money, but maybe I deserved it. You never trusted. Me too, make my own way. Evelyn stepped back, her heart thudding in her chest, not just from fear, but from disbelief. She had always been strict. Yes, always careful. But she had given Tyler every opportunity, every resource, every ounce of love she had left. And yet here he was, blaming her for his own greed. Tyler, she said, her voice trembling now, if you needed money, you could have asked. We could have worked something out. But you didn't ask. You stole. And now, when I ask you why, all you can offer me is blame. He turned toward her, his face twisted in a mix of anger and something deeper shame. Perhaps, though, he didn't let it show. Because you would have said no, he shouted. You always play it safe. If you would have buried that money in some boring account while Leo and I were sitting on a gold mine. This was my shot. I just needed a chance. Evelyn shook her head, slowly the tears finally rising. I would have said no because it wasn't a gold mine, Tyler. It was a scam. You didn't need a chance. You needed a conscience. That last line pierced something in him. For a moment, he looked like a child. Again, cornered and confused, his shoulders curled inward like he might crumble. But then something snapped. You don't get to judge me, he spat, storming toward her. You never trusted me enough to believe in what I could become. You never believed in me. And before she could step aside, before she could retreat, or raise her hands in self-defense, he lunged forward and shoved her hard. It wasn't a stumble or a clumsy bump, was a full-force push. One born of fury and years of resentment. Evelyn's heel caught the edge of the carpet and her balance vanished. She reached out for the banister, missed, and tumbled backward down the staircase in a series of sickening thuds and gasps. Her world spun, pain erupted through her limbs, and the last thing she remembered before everything went black was Tyler's panicked voice shouting her name as he ran down the steps. She awoke in a sterile, humming world. White walls, beeping machines, the soft rustle of nurses' shoes across linoleum. Her eyes fluttered open to a ceiling she didn't recognize and a body that screamed in pain with every breath. Her left arm was in a cast. Her ribs were wrapped tight. Her right leg was elevated and swaddled in bandages. A nurse with kind eyes leaned over her, gently dabbing her forehead with a damp cloth. You're in the hospital, ma'am, she said softly. You've had a fall. You're lucky you didn't break your spine. Evelyn tried to speak, but her throat was dry and scratchy. Tyler, she whispered. My son. The nurse hesitated, then glanced toward the hallway where a police officer stood speaking to a doctor. He brought you in, said you fell. Down the stairs. But her voice trailed off. Evelyn closed her eyes, tears slipping out from beneath her lashes. The pain wasn't just in her bones, it was everywhere, wrapped around her like a second skin. "Did I say something wrong?" the nurse asked, her voice tinged with concern. Evelyn shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered. "I fell, that's all." The lie tasted bitter. She had always taught her students to be brave, to tell the truth, to stand up for themselves. But now, in the fragile wreckage of her body, she couldn't bring herself to say it. Not yet. The next few days passed in a blur of medical procedures. X-rays and questions she didn't want to answer. Tyler didn't visit. He didn't call. No flowers, no cards, not even a message. The nurse, whose name was Clara, seemed to linger near Evelyn's room more than necessary. She fluffed her pillows, adjusted her fur, brought her books and warm blankets. One evening, Clara sat down at the edge of her bed and said, "You don't have to lie for him. You know that, right?" Evelyn turned her face toward the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in strokes of orange and violet. "He's my son," she said quietly. "He made a mistake. He was angry. But he's not a monster." Clara didn't argue. She simply nodded and squeezed Evelyn's hand. "Maybe not. But angry men don't accidentally push their mothers down staircases, and sons who love their mothers don't disappear after they're hurt." A few hours later, Evelyn was woken by a soft knock and the low murmur of voices. The police officer had returned, this time with a notebook and a far more serious expression. "Mrs. Moore," he began, "we have reason to believe there may have been foul play involved in your injury. A neighbor reported hearing shouting, and we have a history of unauthorized financial activity tied to your name." Evelyn's heart pounded. She was still groggy, still piecing everything together. "I told the doctors I fell," she said, trying to sound firm. But her voice was too soft, too weary to be convincing. The officer didn't press. He nodded, jotted a few notes, and left his card on the tray beside her bed. "If you change your mind," he said gently, "we're here to help." It took another week before Evelyn could be discharged. Her body was still battered, but her mind had cleared. Tyler still hadn't come. And in that silence, something hardened inside her. Not hatred, never that, but clarity. She had spent her entire life giving, nurturing, sacrificing. She had done everything to protect Tyler. And yet, when she needed him most, he had vanished, leaving behind a trail of financial ruin and broken bones. The day she returned home was the first day of her new life. Clara drove her, helping her up the front steps and into the house that now felt cold and haunted. The staircase loomed like a ghost, but Evelyn didn't look at it. She looked instead at the locked filing cabinet, at the laptop she hadn't touched since that terrible morning, and at the envelope of evidence she had carefully assembled before everything spiraled out of control. That night, after Clara left, Evelyn made herself a cup of tea, opened the police officer's business card, and made a decision. She picked up the phone. "Detective Rains," she said. "This is Evelyn Moore. I'd like to report a crime. I'm ready to tell the truth." The days after Evelyn made the call to the detective felt like stepping out of a dense fog she had lived in for far too long. There was something sobering and strangely empowering about speaking the truth. Finally saying out loud what she had tried to silence even within herself. The words had come slowly at first, trembling and hesitant, but as she spoke to the officer, detailing everything from the bank fraud to the push down the stairs, she felt her voice steady. She had never imagined that motherhood, the role she had treasured above all, would lead her here, filing charges against her only son. But the betrayal was too deep to ignore, and Evelyn knew that if she didn't take a stand now, she wouldn't just be surrendering her justice, she'd be surrendering the last shred of dignity she had left. Over the following weeks, her world became consumed with meetings and appointments. Social workers came to the house, kind and patient, asking her questions she'd never imagined she'd answer. The bank's fraud division launched a full investigation, uncovering a network of financial transactions that all led back to Tyler's schemes and Leo's dubious LLC. Legal advisors walked her through court procedures, how to protect herself, how to reclaim her identity, her credit, and perhaps some of her assets. And through it all, Evelyn kept going, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Her body was healing. Her bruises faded, the cast came off, her bones slowly regained their strength. But what mattered more was the quiet transformation happening inside her. The Evelyn who once begged for her son's affection, who gave without boundary, who silenced her own voice in the name of family, was gone. In her place stood a woman who had tasted the full sting of betrayal and decided not to let it define her. Tyler, for his part, didn't reach out. He disappeared after the incident, and not even the police could find him for a while. It was Leo who finally gave them the break they needed. After being pulled in for unrelated fraud charges, Leo had tried to cut a deal, trading information about Tyler's involvement in exchange for leniency. That's when the authorities discovered the paper trail emails, digital signatures, device fingerprints, all pointing directly at Tyler. They issued a warrant for his arrest, and within days, he was picked up in another city trying to pitch yet another startup idea to a desperate investor. When he was brought back in handcuffs, Evelyn wasn't at the courthouse, but she knew. She felt it not just in her gut, but in the way the air seemed clearer that morning, like something toxic had finally lifted. The trial moved faster than she expected. Evelyn sat quietly in the courtroom as the prosecution presented the evidence. Screenshots of wire transfers, IP logs, forged emails with her digital signature attached, and statements from the bank's fraud team. Her neighbor testified that they'd heard yelling the night of the injury, saw Tyler storm out of the house, and noticed Evelyn's porch light stay off for days afterward. But the moment that made the courtroom fall into a breathless hush was when the security footage from her front door camera was played. Evelyn hadn't even known it captured the sound Tyler yelling, her pleading, the thud of her fall, the panic in his voice afterward. She closed her eyes as it played, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks. It wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. And finally, it was undeniable. Tyler's defense attorney tried to argue that Evelyn was confused, that the fall was accidental, that the financial transactions were misunderstood permissions. But the evidence crushed those arguments flat. Tyler sat slouched in his chair, occasionally flashing a smug grin or whispering to his lawyer. When he took the stand, he painted himself as the misunderstood entrepreneur, a son trying to save his mother from her fear of risk. But even the jury saw through it. His arrogance, his entitlement, the way he showed no remorse, it all built a picture of a man who believed he could get away with anything, even hurting the one person who had loved him most. When the verdict came in, Evelyn didn't cry. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, as the judge sentenced Tyler to 3 years in prison for financial fraud, identity theft, and aggravated assault. He didn't look at her once as they led him away. And that, more than anything, was the final nail. Evelyn knew in her heart that her son was going to not in body, but in soul. He had chosen this path, and now she would choose hers. After the trial, Evelyn returned home, but not for long. The house no longer felt safe. Every creak in the floorboards, every glance at the staircase, every corner held echoes of pain. So she sold it. She didn't hesitate. With the help of the bank and financial advocates, she managed to recover a portion of her savings, far less than what she'd lost, but enough to start again. She bought a small one-story cottage in a quiet town 2 hours away with friendly neighbors, a gated porch, and motion-activated lights. She installed cameras, changed all her passwords, and signed up for identity theft monitoring. But more than that, she began to reclaim herself. For the first time in her life, she was no longer defined by her role as a mother. She was simply Evelyn, a woman who had survived, a woman who had learned. Then one morning, as the spring breeze carried the scent of blooming lilacs through her kitchen window, Evelyn did something bold. She booked a flight to Italy, It's the same tour she had once dreamed of but never dared to take. She packed light just a carry-on, a journal, and a photo of herself smiling before all of this had happened. The trip was everything she had imagined and more. She walked the cobblestone streets of Florence, tasted wine in the rolling hills of Tuscany, dipped her toes in the Mediterranean. She sat alone in cafes and watched strangers pass by, listened to street musicians, and laughed genuinely, deeply, for the first time in what felt like years. She thought of Roger often on that trip, how proud he would have been, how he would have told her she deserved this long ago. And though she still thought of Tyler, the grief felt different now, softer, distant, like an old wound that no longer ached when touched. When she returned, Evelyn didn't go back to hiding. She began volunteering at local community centers, sharing her story with small groups of women, mostly older, who had gone through financial abuse at the hands of family. She talked about red flags, about boundaries, about the dangers of blind trust. Her talks grew popular, and soon she was invited to speak at larger events, even featured in a podcast episode about elder abuse. Then a journalist approached her, asking to write an article about her journey. The piece was titled, "He Stole My Retirement and Pushed Me Down the Stairs, But I Rose Higher Than Ever." It went viral. Thousands of women reached out. Some shared their stories. Others simply said thank you. And Evelyn realized she hadn't just survived. She had sparked something by the 1-year anniversary of the incident. Evelyn stood before a full auditorium of professionals and survivors delivering a keynote about resilience. She wore a navy blue suit, her hair pulled back, her voice clear and commanding, no longer frail, no longer invisible. She ended her speech with the words, "Sometimes the people you love the most will be the ones who betray you the deepest. But that doesn't mean you have to stay broken. Your story doesn't end in the fall. It begins in the rising." The crowd stood and applauded. Cameras flashed, and Evelyn smiled not for anyone else but for herself. Back home that night, Evelyn sat on her porch beneath a sky littered with stars. The world was quiet, peaceful. She sipped a cup of tea, her fingers tracing the rim thoughtfully. Her phone buzzed beside her. A message from a woman in Idaho who had just read the article. It said simply, "You gave me the courage to leave. Thank you." Evelyn pressed the phone to her chest and closed her eyes. She didn't know what the future held. Tyler would be released eventually, and she had no idea if he'd try to reconnect. But she also knew this. She was no longer a woman waiting for someone to love her, right? She had learned to love herself, to protect herself, and to live her life not in fear, but in fierce freedom. And that, in the end, was her final lesson. Not just for Tyler, but for anyone who thought they could break her spirit and walk away.